So just a brief video for week 3 in which you look at some different materials. We're starting our main text, Hold Paramount, reading chapters 1 and 2, and we're also talking about some materials I gave you that are associated with what I'm calling ethical decision-making or moral decision-making models. And I'd like to explain, my reasoning there, why I've done this, and maybe say a few things about those models. Number one, model provided by Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Let's just refer to that as Kantianism, or the Kantian models. And number two, so-called consequentialism, a major school of which is utilitarianism. So it may be that I refer to those two things, consequentialism and utilitarianism, interchangeably, although one would probably say that utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, but certainly it's major school. Looking at the first two chapters of this book, you see that it's written in fictional form. There are various boxes that give you sort of asides about moral theory or the history of engineering, and they're quite helpful. But the major reason that I chose this text is that I thought it would be helpful to have concrete situations, albeit fictional ones, to discuss when we're talking about engineering ethics issues. Also, that the book actually, if you look at the chapter titles of the book is really guided by the ASCE Code of Ethics, and you'll see that the relevance of engineering codes of ethics is a continuing issue that I wanted to pursue in this class. We will return to those codes of ethics. We will look at different case studies in which those codes of ethics are applied by various engineering societies. But looking at chapters 1 and 2, there's various materials, but I thought that what was most interesting about it is that in chapter 1, with our fictional character Chris, we have various ethical situations, none of which is really has anything to do with engineering ethics. They're just various moral situations that the character finds himself or herself. We don't know if it's a man or a woman, so I'll say both or one or the other. I don't mean to imply that I know. That Chris finds himself in of various importance. The most sort of shocking one is the one where he's driving drunk and he comes across an accident victim on the road and decides not to stay and help because he knows that he's intoxicated and doesn't want to deal with consequences of that. So he drives on to a rest stop so he can make an anonymous call. So there's something really obviously bad about that, But it's an interesting contrast with the situation that the character of Kelly finds herself in. I think she is definitely a woman. A friend of Chris, she finds herself in chapter 2, in which, well, I was going to say where it's obviously an engineering ethics issue, but maybe it's not so obvious, because I think if I'm reading it rightly, the character of Kelly is not actually practicing engineering in her job, although clearly there is question about whether or not she should, as an engineer, even if not a practicing one, do something about the problem that she sees. Well, what we have are, ethical problems, and we might say, on the face of it, that Chris makes the wrong decision in chapter 1. I think most of us would agree, although I have had students who said that, when you weigh the consequences of stopping, the negative consequences for him or her and her family, that Chris might have legitimate reason for driving on and not risking a DUI, although I think it's pretty weak. We have these ethical problems, and Kelly's ethical problem about what she should do, if anything, about the fact that her company is poisoning the environment without breaking the law, but poisoning the environment with a type of chromium, basically using a flaw in the regulations to get away with it. Whether she has a duty to do something, duty to the public to do something, those who could be harmed by it. Well, my idea here is, and the reason that we're looking at the codes of ethics here, we're pretty much focusing on the ASCE code at the moment, and the reason I gave you these two ethical decision-making models because my idea is this, is that a course like this should not be, well, what it should be is something that helps you develop tools for ethical decision-making, but it should have practical value. And I don't know if you will run into the kind of situation, say, that Kelly's in, or the kind of situation that Chris finds him or herself in later in the book in your engineering career, but it's quite possible that you will. And the idea is that a course like this should put you in a better position to do the right thing, which first of all means determining what the right thing is. Now it seems to me that when you, in your role as an engineer, are faced with ethical issues, that you have really four, I'm sort of maybe artificially saying four different things. You definitely have two things. One is just your native resources, your ethical resources, your moral capabilities. We all have them. They're the capabilities with which we make ethical decisions in our ordinary lives. They have to do with our beliefs, our feelings, our attitudes, our habits, and they are reflective of the characters we have and the kind of people that we are. We are, most of us, I would say, unless there's something seriously wrong with us, capable of figuring out ethical situations for ourselves. So we all have that, and we all rely on that, whatever that is. Number two, as engineers, you have the code. Whatever code it is that we're looking at, most of them are pretty much the same. You have the code as some kind of reference, and maybe sometimes that code, like any code, cannot give you a definite answer because we have general rules and every situation is different, but at least we have some guidance there, and in some cases we have very clear answers about what we can and can't do. So we have our native ethical resources, and we have the code. And what I'm offering in terms of Kant and consequentialism are two other resources, which I think are good to look at, and I wanted to supplement what the book had to say, because the book does talk about, I think in chapter 2, about ethical decision-making models. I think that there could have been a better job done there, because when we look at Kant, and when we look at utilitarianism or consequentialism, we are given very definite frameworks for how to decide moral questions. And one might say that these frameworks are simply formalizations of those native resources that I referred to earlier. That in some way or another we take our intuitions about what's right and wrong, and Kant takes them in one direction and gives us a certain method or matrix, perhaps, to apply to concrete ethical situations, and utilitarianism or consequentialism takes another one of our intuitions and formalizes it. In both cases, what we have are methods that can be applied to reach an answer in an ethical situation, whether it's the right answer, whether it's a sufficient answer, whether it's an answer that we can live with and actually want to follow. That's another question entirely. But you'll find that there is an answer in many cases. That is, it is a method that can be applied. And I think that it's important to look at these things, and it's important to have such tools at our command, because however much we ultimately rely on our ethical competence, our general moral intuitions about things, in certain situations, especially very difficult ones, it does actually require that we think things through a little bit more carefully and a little more rationally. And Kant and utilitarianism offer us methods for doing so. So what I'd like to do in the next essay is just speak briefly about those, or in the next video, not the next essay, speak briefly about those ethical decision-making models.